See how nice they are. Christine, should we get going?
Yes, okay, we'll get started. All right, welcome everyone to our panel on COVID and climate. We have a lot prepared to discuss today and 5 wonderful and expert speakers, so I'll try to keep this intro short. My name is Christine, one of the co-moderators for this panel. The other moderator will be Sydney, and we are both organizers with LEAP U of T. LEAP U of T is the University of Toronto chapter of the global organization, the LEAP, which focuses on some of the same intersections of environmental and social justice, which we'll be discussing today. Alongside running the fossil fuel divestment campaign at U of T since 2017, our campus group also organizes rallies, solidarity actions, and educational events like this one. If you're a U of T student interested in doing direct climate action work or interdisciplinary educational events like this, don't hesitate to reach out. Our meetings are open to everyone, and we'll publish information about an upcoming general meeting on our Facebook soon. We'll be hosting a number of similar events in the near future, and we also have a summer book club that's super fun. I can attest to that because I've been going regularly. This webinar is also being hosted by UC Lit Sustainability. So if you're a UC student interested in doing climate justice work, you can join UC Lit Sustainability by contacting their social media pages or sending them an email at sustainability@uclit.ca. As an audience member and attendee, feel free to use the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. This can be accessed by clicking Q&A at the bottom right of your screen and typing in any questions you may have. Questions will only be answered if they're posted in the Q&A, so please don't post questions in the chat. We'll only answer them if they're in the Q&A. The chat will be mainly used to provide viewers with links to any information or articles that are relevant to the discussion. Sophia and Julia, 2 other organizers with LEAP, will be moderating the Q&A, monitoring the Q&A, and posting resources in the chat and letting us know if there are any questions. We'll take a few questions during the panel, but most will be saved for a designated Q&A period during the last half hour of the webinar. A few more notes. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel later with closed captions available. The link to our YouTube channel will be posted in the chat, and we'll also post in the Facebook event page for this webinar when the recording is uploaded. The webinar is about 2 hours, so 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll have a 5-minute break at the 1 hour mark, so around 6 p.m. And with that, Sydney, do you want to do the land acknowledgement?
Yeah, sure. Welcome to this webinar. We're really grateful that with video conferencing, we can bring this panel to a wider audience of people from many places. Our group is based in the city called Toronto, and many viewers may have ties to this place, so I'll talk about it a bit. This place that we call Toronto has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. And the name Toronto has its origins in a word in the Wendat language, which refers to a type of dam that's used for fishing. For millennia, this land was an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples to engage in seasonal fishing activities, commerce, and cultural exchange. And for this reason, this word that named our city has gone on to take on other meanings in diverse Indigenous languages, meanings such as the gathering place. So even in the naming of our city, we can see that this place was and is an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples. This land has been inhabited by the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations. In the Dish with One Spoon, the dish represents the land around the Great Lakes with all of its resources, and each one of us has just one spoon to eat from. By using the spoon to take only what we need, we can leave land and resources for others to enjoy as we work together to secure the livelihoods of future generations. And notably, the Dish with One Spoon doesn't include a knife. Nobody is to cut out a portion larger than they need. There's to be no hoarding of resources or wealth, especially not when others in the community go hungry. We're very, very grateful to have the opportunity to work and reside in this territory. And if you'd like to learn more about the Indigenous history of Toronto, a really good starting place was published in issue number 1 of U of T's First Nations House magazine. The link to that will be posted in the chat. And with that, let's begin the panel. We're here to speak with some experts from Toronto and beyond to discuss the intersections of COVID and climate. To start it off, I'll invite each speaker to take about 3 or 4 minutes to introduce themselves and their work. We'll start with Terri Chu.
Hi, thanks a lot for inviting me. And I see from the comments there, someone else has a climate crush on Dr. Elizabeth Sawin. So you're not alone. I think everyone has a crush on Dr. Sawin. I actually follow her on Twitter, and I'm like, oh, you're going to put me on the same panel as her. Amazing. So thank you very much for inviting me. Very here. So my name's Terri, and my former life, I was an engineer in the energy sector. I was the person who did a lot of the analysis for energy projects. I would look at it from the top level and say, oh, if we do this, this, and this, it's going to have this kind of impact on cost, on natural gas use, on greenhouse gas emissions. So I was that kind of person that did a lot of that work on the systems level of an energy. And what I was finding was that not very many of my projects actually turned into the renewable energy projects I was hoping they would be. And because of that, I actually now I'm back in school doing work in climate communication of how do we actually convince people to actually do what we already know needs to be done. The technology piece isn't missing, it's the actual communication piece now. So I am in the communication studies, and right now I'm working on a project about COVID-19 and the racism and exactly what is going on in terms of the impact on the Chinese community. Many of us are facing xenophobia specifically. We are a lot of microaggression and in some cases violence against the community because of COVID-19. So I'm working on a project right now that's looking into a lot of those issues.
Awesome, we're excited to have you on here. Yasmeen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my name's Yasmeen, and I'm coming to you from so-called Toronto on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. And yeah, I'm just a community member who organizes with Climate Justice Toronto and a bunch of other like anti-racism and anti-Black racism groups in so-called Toronto. I'm doing my master's right now also at the University of Toronto and did my undergrad there as well. And my master's work specifically looks at how gentrification should be considered a facet of environmental racism in the context of the urban. So a lot of my own experience, sorry, also there are planes that fly over my house, so if you hear that, that's what's happening. But yeah, so a lot of the work that I've been engaging in is centered in community and something yeah, I'm just super grateful to be here just because like everything that I know and hold is through like lived experience and community. And so hopefully I can provide some outlet to folks about that. But yeah, just really looking at the intersections of how the climate crisis cannot be tackled without naming it, from coming from the roots of colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism, as well as like the climate movement having to center Indigenous sovereignty, racial justice, migrant justice, queer justice, and all of those things in order for it to, yeah, for this movement to be one. So really grateful for this experience and looking forward to hearing from everyone else. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen. Next up, Troy, would you like to introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. So my name is Troy Vettese. I'm an environmental historian. I was trained at NYU, but I'm from Toronto, and now I'm associated with the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University. And I study mostly neoliberal environmental thought. So I look at cap and trade, geoengineering, extinction economics, and things like that. But I also work on more future-oriented work. I'm writing a book right now with Drew Pendergrass, who is also at Harvard, and he's an environmental engineer, and we're trying to imagine what society after capitalism could look like. So we look at the problems of extinction, renewable energy, and rewilding together within the framework of land scarcity to figure out how to solve those problems, what a society that would solve those problems actually look like. And in that work, I came to think more about disease and epidemics, because all these things are related. As if we leave less land to nature, then you're going to get epidemics. So I shifted to that when COVID started, and I've written a few things in The Guardian and Jacobin and things like that. And our book is going to come out in Verso Press next year, and it's going to be called Half Earth Socialism.
Awesome, thank you, Troy. Melana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Melana. I am based in Takaranto, in Toronto here, so I appreciated local land acknowledgement, so thank you for that. I am of Caribbean descent, but have grown up and lived here as a first-generation Canadian. And I feel a little bit like an outlier in this group of incredible environmentalists, as I often don't think of myself as an environmentalist or someone working in the environmental space. I typically work on food systems and food policy issues, but there's a deep connection between that work and environmental policy and broader challenges that are seen within that landscape. So very glad to be here. I'm the chair of Food Secure Canada, which is a pan-Canadian alliance of individuals, Indigenous communities, organizations, academics, and grassroots groups, as well as farmers and food workers, really trying to imagine a vision of an alternative food landscape in Canada, and has been pushing for a national food policy. And we do that through working to achieve a healthy, just, sustainable food system. I also am a member of the Toronto Food Policy Council, which is a body here in the city that helps drive local policy around food and has a large connection with a number of issues connected to climate and environmental issues, from the Transform TO policy as an official reference group to thinking about community gardens, land use, policy around food waste and different supply chains connected to food. So very, very linked to this conversation. I've also have a bit of a pivot in my work. I am currently working as the project manager of the Power Lab. And the Power Lab is an organization or a group that works with local community groups across the city, trying to center issues around climate justice, racial justice, and economic justice, and creating spaces for power building among groups who are typically excluded from conversations about what the economy is. And I think that it's really critical that we're trying to link these three connected spheres to have that conversation and create space for those groups. And last, I'll just share that in terms of the context of COVID-19, because how can we forget about that? I've recently been appointed the UN delegate to think about the Commission on Population and Development, which is focusing on food security, nutrition, and health in the context of COVID-19 and what Canada's position is going to be. So really thinking about these issues globally, how they connect to different systems, from our food systems to health, to equity, to access for all people, but particularly those who are most impacted by those systems. So very grateful to be with these speakers tonight to dig deeper in this conversation.
Thank you for bringing this expertise. We're excited to hear from you later. And our last panelist, Dr. Sawin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm Beth Sawin. I'm the co-director of Climate Interactive. I live and work out of a home office in Vermont. So I'm enjoying being with you all in Toronto. Climate Interactive is an organization that looks at climate change from the point of view of complex systems. So I guess that's the overall perspective I'll bring today. We know, of course, that climate change is a problem about greenhouse gases and global temperature and sea level rise. But of course, climate touches everything else and is influenced by everything else. And I think the other panelists have named, so many of the important issues of justice and food and health. And I think Sydney and Julia and their colleagues have done a really good job, and Christine, of pulling together this perspective. So yeah, I'd be excited to just jump in and start looking for connections.
Awesome, thank you so much. We'll start with some questions, and I think Christine has one that she'd like to ask first to start.
Okay, yeah, first question of the night, Dr. Sawin. It's easy to think of COVID-19 and climate change as separate crises that must be tackled individually. Why might this kind of thinking not be the case, and what can we learn from studying them together?
Yeah, well, I think that is a really excellent place to start from. And I've been sort of collecting stories of how these issues are all interconnected. So maybe I'll just share a couple of them from all over the world. And I bet people on the call have examples too, you know, throw those into the question and answer box for others to see maybe. So early on in the COVID-19 crisis, there was a tropical cyclone in the South Pacific. And there were people who were trying to get to a safe place relative to the pandemic who were swept off of a ferry and lost their lives. And then Fiji, especially hard hit, had populations they were trying to shelter from the cyclone and the loss of their homes. But, you know, trying to figure out how to do that in a way that was safe relative to COVID-19. And here in the United States, we're moving into hurricane season. I think it officially started on June 1st. So we have communities bracing for hurricanes with many of those same questions. We have the same budgets focused on emergency response to the pandemic and emergency response to climate impacts. We have stories, and I know you've all seen these, you know, about, well, the air is getting cleaner because communities are on lockdown, and maybe that means less greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have stories from China and the United States about relaxing environmental protections to try to keep the economy strong in the midst of a pandemic. And so we have our response to the pandemic potentially making climate change worse. We have climate impacts potentially making the pandemic harder to manage. Then we also know a long history of studying disasters of all sorts. The way that we respond to them largely widens the gaps, racial equity gaps, racial wealth gaps, other types of inequities. And so, you know, the way we're responding with lockdowns has economic pressures often on the most marginalized communities. So what you start to see is that these three issues of inequality, climate change, and COVID-19, you know, not only are they interacting, but they're each basically threat multipliers for the others. And so that raises some risks. One risk is if we address these problems in isolation, there's the chance that the way we respond to one makes the others worse. So there I would hold up China or the United States relaxing environmental protections in response to the pandemic. The other potential risk is if we address one problem but don't make progress on the others, then our success in addressing one problem is really endangered by the others. So think about all the local businesses. I know in my community, we're trying to help restaurants and bakeries and coffee shops just weather the pandemic. Well, that's not going to do a lot of good if then they get hit by a storm surge or a wildfire. And so everything that we put into supporting our communities through the pandemic is at risk if we don't also address climate change. So those are two risks. And on the flip side, those are risks of addressing these things in separation. On the flip side, I think, is this huge potential, which we're seeing in some responses around the world. To address them together, we can take a leap forward on all these issues. So if climate change means we have to basically reinvent our built environment and our regulations and our energy system, well, what are the opportunities to do that in a way that addresses things like structural racism at the same time? If you have to rebuild everything, you can rebuild it in a way that fits our values better than the system that we've inherited. There's also, and we can talk more as the hour goes on, but as we're facing certainly recessions, if not depression, we're going to have to be very careful allocating resources. And so anytime that we can use one investment to solve these multiple issues at the same time, it's just, you know, practical, prudent, efficient to figure out how to do that. So those are some of the potential. If we can figure out how to bring these issues together, there's just real potential to move forward on them all together.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, you know, we'll have to sort of address where these all come from. Troy, we know that, you know, you've mentioned and written on like COVID and the climate crisis being two different crises that are entangled together in a broader crisis. Do you want to speak about this a bit and like what this broader crisis is that allowed both of these to happen and where it originates?
Sure. I mean, I think when we think about any environmental crisis, we divide them up and we talk about extinction or algae blooms or pollution and climate change and so forth, and epidemics. Also, this is a parrot on my shoulder, just in case the audience notices that. It's my mom's African gray named Rosie. So sorry about that. But we talk about all these problems as if they're discrete problems, but really they're the same problem. And they're the same problem in a very practical way, which is whenever we are redirecting natural flows, like previously natural systems, and we're redirecting them towards our ends, and that means whether we cut down a forest and replace it, with a farm, or we dig a mine, or if we capture animals for eating or for pets, all these things will have an impact, and they will have an impact on each other. So I think, for example, I think one way to think about the problem of land is to think about how do we divide up the world, right? So the largest single use of land is for animal agriculture. I think the number is something like 27% of all land is used for animal agriculture. And if you don't include desert or mountains, it's something like 40% of all inhabitable land is used for livestock, which is a huge amount. So what does that mean? First of all, it means that all that land, much of it used to be wild quite recently, and that means you're getting closer to having an interface between domestic animals and wild animals, and a disease can cross over quite easily. And we saw this with Nipah, for instance, in Malaysia, when a disease from a wild bat got infected a domestic pig and then went to humans and got people quite sick at a very high mortality rate, around 60%. So you see this interface there, but then we think about climate. Well, how do we actually solve climate change? So a big thing, like probably the easiest to reduce emissions is to get rid of emissions from agriculture. If we got rid of emissions from livestock, that alone would be worth around 18%. And there's good reason to think we should include the respiration of animals in our calculations for CO2 emissions, because we have many more animals alive today than we would have in a natural system, because we simply have all this productive fossil fuel agriculture is keeping billions and billions of animals alive, and they're respiring and emitting CO2s. If you include that, it's like 50% of emissions. But if you get rid of all that, because we don't need animal agriculture, then suddenly you have space for rewilding. So that can sequester huge amounts of carbon. And the IPCC talks about this. If we need diet shifts to sequester carbon, it's the safest and cheapest way to do it on a large scale. And also it would create a buffer between us and the natural world. So that interface between us and wild animals, where zoonotic disease comes from, that would be closed. So that's it. I mean, that's the real way to solve the problem. And the American Public Health Association calls for a moratorium on factory farms. Conservation is a huge part of planetary health. I mean, there's lots of people who recognize this. This is not like a minor thing. This is a major way we can deal with zoonotic disease, but also with climate change. And it's similar, if you want to stop extinctions, you have to leave more land in preserves and natural habitats and so forth. So, I mean, I can keep going on, but really all these problems are interrelated because we are infringing on natural systems. And I think once we recognize that, then we could see some solutions, but we will need to change our society quite a bit to make that work.
Thank you, Troy. Yeah, everything is so connected. And it was already mentioned before, but really important in these discussions about COVID and climate is that despite these being sort of universal issues, not everybody in society and not everyone on Earth will be affected by them in the same ways. I was wondering, Yasmeen, if you'd like to talk about, why is this the case, and what are these systems that continue to reinforce cycles of oppression in marginalized communities, which will be most affected by the effects of climate change and by COVID-19?
Yeah, for sure. I think when we're looking at the way in which this pandemic has been disproportionately affecting BIPOC communities, we have to think about how this was already happening before the pandemic even started, right? And so, like you mentioned, there are so many systemic oppressions that have been embedded into our society. So long before the pandemic, we've already had issues in, I'll give some context in like the Ontario or so-called Ontario context, where communities like Aamjiwnaang First Nation or Grassy Narrows have been denied livelihood and access to health because of the toxins in their community. And this isn't by chance, and this isn't a coincidence. BIPOC communities, specifically Black and Indigenous communities, continue to not have access to their structural determinants of health. So if the medical system is already racist and has all these barriers of discrimination, in which is built on the fact that eugenics is still so prevalent in our medical system. For so long, it was said that Black people weren't able to feel the same pain, and that's why doctors could perform these experimental operations and tests on Black enslaved folks. And we see that carry out into this modern time where Black women, especially, there's a higher mortality rate for mothers, right? And it doesn't make sense because we're all human. So why would there be a difference? And it goes back to those systemic structures of racism built into everything. And so when we're thinking about the way in which this pandemic is hitting, and we're looking at Navajo First Nation, all of the ways in which it's uncovering, I guess, these injustices that have lasted for so long. It's resurfacing and it's coming to light, but it's not new. And I think that's the thing that we really need to emphasize, is that Black and Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by racism and systemic environmental racism. So when we add a pandemic and a health crisis, it's going to get worse, and it's going to continue to, like Dr. Sawin said, increase the gaps in this discrimination. So yeah, I think also, like Troy mentioned, there is this need or this idea that we should separate the climate crisis into all these different structures and all these different movements. But it's really, really important that we address how racism is showing up in these spaces, because without that, then everything looks like coincidence, and it looks like, wow, this is just happening. But we know that it isn't a coincidence. So that was really like broad, but yeah, I would be happy to dig into more specifics. But yeah, it's definitely just,
Yeah, thank you. Melana or maybe Terri, do you guys have anything to add to this?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I really appreciated what Yasmeen added. And I really, think it was important to really lay the groundwork to understand that this is a challenge that's been happening long before COVID-19, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities have seen higher levels of inequality across the environmental landscape. So whether you're thinking about, for me, working in a food security space, these numbers are quite stark. Black Canadians have 3.5 times the rate of food insecurity as compared to white Canadians. And and if you think about Black children, there's a 34% increase compared to 10% of white Canadian children here. And if you're looking at Indigenous populations, those numbers really skyrocket, with 48% of First Nations families experiencing challenges getting food to the table. Those are really just symptoms of a greater systemic issue. And I think that what's really important to link here is that access to food is not only about thinking about the quality of the food that they're accessing. So whether they're living in a northern community and there aren't adequate routes to get that food, but about having culturally appropriate food. So Yasmeen mentioned the idea of environmental racism playing a key role here. And that is particularly important to connect when thinking about race, because when we're thinking about populations who've experienced significant discrimination, groups who are immigrants who are coming to other countries and trying to find solace after leaving war or difficult situations, or perhaps just trying to integrate into a new culture and society. Food is one of those, key elements that really supports communities and is really linked as part of a social determinant of health. So if you're thinking you're trying to connect back to your culture as an Indigenous person and you can't access your cultural foods, whether that's being able to hunt or fish on reserve, not even be able to have access to water and proper sanitation. And you don't only see this with Indigenous populations, you see this also with communities living in Nova Scotia, the historic Black community there, with lots of stories about what environmental racism has looked like, and specifically how decisions have been made that have undermined their broader health outcomes. And I think this is particularly, compounds the experience of COVID-19 because the environmental racism experienced, and these can be things like quality of housing, so having more likely to have mold in your housing, poor insulation in your housing, where your housing is located. Those are all important environmental factors. Quality of air in the area you're living, whether it's polluted. These are setting up situations where they're more likely to have underlying chronic diseases, making them more susceptible to COVID-19. And so some of the outcomes are increased death, particularly among Black populations who are more likely to experience things like low levels of income or education. And I think what's really challenging about this is there have been a lot of calls more broadly within the healthcare sector of Black, Indigenous, people of color who are advocating to see shifts to have disaggregated data taken here in Canada to be able to think about mapping this problem, understanding what are the factors, what are the rates and the distinctions. And there's been a general blatant disregard to be able to create the systems and the structures in place to start to address these things. So as someone very interested in policy, you can see the systemic ways in that reinforce these systems of oppression that you've talked about. And I imagine Terri would have a lot to add as well, particularly from the experience of Asian Canadians who also experience disproportionate discrimination in the area of environmental racism.
I would like to throw in a question from our Q&A that I regret not seeing earlier. Somebody has just asked, what is environmental racism? And you spoke to it really well, but would you like to give a sort of definition?
Yeah, I would love to do that. So environmental racism is a development and implementation of environmental policy, usually more specifically around toxic waste disposal, sites like pollution, urban decay, in areas that specifically undermine or adversely impact racialized or ethnic groups. And so the example I referenced earlier was a community, a historic Black community, one of the oldest Black communities actually here in Canada, in Nova Scotia. And right beside the free housing they were given as, a thank you to acting as soldiers in the war, was right beside a toxic chemical dump that was beside the entire community. And as a result of being given housing by that dump, almost 50% of the community has died off throughout the years through cancer and other illnesses associated with the environmental pollution. So that's kind of an example of how policy, actions, initiatives related to the environment has adversely impacted ethnic group. And I think Yasmeen also mentioned grassy narrows, but there's tons of examples across Canada and across the world really that adversely impacts or negates racial and ethnic voice and needs in the scope of environmental policy and work.
Thank you for that very succinct but impactful definition. Terri, can you speak to the wave of xenophobia that emerged with the pandemic? And how did a pandemic allow underlying xenophobia and racism that was already existing to become so overt?
Yeah, well, there's definitely an underlying a bubbling, simmering amongst society. And if I want, can I go back to what Melana was saying? It's
yeah, go ahead.
Very interesting from my perspective as someone with a Chinese background, as we were actually following the pandemic since basically Christmas. And we watched Wuhan go into lockdown. And I think there was like a wave of like, oh my gosh, I think everybody held their collective breath going, I can't believe they just did that to 48 million people. And I'm actually very surprised that we actually did anything here, not because I didn't think that the risk was very real, but because as and Melana had alluded to, people dying has always been a very normal cost of our way of capitalism. Like, we've always accepted that people die. And I think what the difference was this time around was who was dying. Because this very much was a rich person's disease in many ways, because it was spread first primarily by those who could afford to fly. And if you're dirt poor, you can't fly. Flying is still, I mean, it's come down a lot in price, but it's still quite expensive. And so if you look at who was actually impacted first, like when China was hit, we all kind of went, well, yeah, we don't really know what's going on yet. Iran was hit. I think everyone kind of ignored that. And then finally, Italy got hit. And then we went, oh, this could happen to us. And it wasn't until it happened to Italy that anyone actually cared about it. And if you want to take that same thing with a parallel on the environmental front, I mean, you see that a lot too, of who gets affected. And right now, primarily, it is the people of color who are getting hit much, much harder than people in rich countries. And what I mean by that is, for example, last year, there was a lot of flooding in September. And I'm specifically zeroing on September because I did a small project on this, analyzing Canada's newspaper of record. Who are not familiar with Canadian news organizations. That's the Globe and Mail. They have the highest circulation in the entire country, and they call themselves Canada's newspaper of record. And in this period, I think it's 2 or 3 week period that I had looked at, in this time frame, I compared the number of floods that was going on around the world, and they were impacting millions of people. Literally, like 500,000 people at a time were being displaced out of their homes. And the Globe and Mail had not one mention. Not, but they talked about flooding in Texas. They talked about flooding in Bahamas. You know, they talked about a lot of different issues. But climate change didn't even appear as a thing. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't impacting people that they actually cared about. So if you're a decision maker in Toronto and your primary source of news is Canada's newspaper of record, you didn't even know that several million people on another continent, because it didn't even impact, and yet you didn't even read about it. You literally didn't know. And the typhoon at the same time was happening on the other side of the planet at the same time that Hurricane Dorian was happening. And I think the typhoon it didn't at all in this newspaper. So these things don't exist. And so when we want to go back to linking, you know, what is it about the racism piece and the environment piece? Well, people are already being impacted. And yet people here in a rich nation, in one of the most educated populations on the planet, had no idea that any of this was happening. So when you want to talk about underlying xenophobia and racism, the first thing you got to tackle is the fact that nobody knows this is happening. Because that first layer is that these people are so unimportant, we don't even care to mention them.
And kind of a sentiment I've been hearing is, why should Asians show up for Black Lives Matter when their experiences with racism during the COVID-19 pandemic were not as heard? How would you respond to this? And how do we as minorities reject being kind of pitted against each other?
You know, that's actually a very big one. And there is a big problem with anti-Black racism in the Asian community. It is a problem that's been festering for a very, very long time. Myself, my own experience, there was a lot of anti-Black racism in my, and as Asians, we absolutely need to address this, because right now, what we are facing as a group, like, you know, there was a woman in Burnaby who was just kicked, an 84-year-old woman. I don't know if you guys saw the video about that. She was toppled to the ground with her walker, and all for being Asian. And for the first time in my life, I'm actually feeling fear for my physical safety, which has never happened before. I grew up in London, Ontario, never once felt fear for my safety. You know, there's all sorts of other aspects of racism that I grew up with. I've been spat on, I've been, you know, things thrown at me, eggs have been thrown at me, but I've never actually felt fear. And right now that fear is there, it's very real, and yet that fear is a fraction a mere fraction of what Black people in our communities face on a day-to-day basis. And this fear is happening because of COVID, because of statements like the Kung flu. It's giving permission for people to be jerks to us, frankly. But yet we as a community have to remember that fear is a fraction of what Black people are facing. We absolutely need to step up, and we are not doing it. As a community, we are failing because we expect people to step up for us. We have to be there for them.
And Melana, I know you want to talk about this, so let's hear it.
I really, really appreciated Terry's comments. I think it's a challenge that's not only between the Asian community and Black communities, but I see this also between Black and Indigenous communities about a pitting. And I think, someone said it beautifully in a conversation I was having recently, is that, the people who are creating these fictitious divides between us are actually not people of color. They're actually external voices around colonialism, come from traditions around shadeism, come from a way to separate us when in fact we have a common struggle. We have a common experience of not being the folks that were sitting at the table when a lot of these systems of discrimination were put together. And I think it's actually within that broader system's interest to keep us apart and divided, because we're less powerful that way. And I think in seeing and finding solidarity in racial justice for Asian Canadians, racial justice for Black Canadians, racial justice for Indigenous peoples, imagine what it would be if we had as much outrage simply even around the condition of Indigenous peoples. I think it's incredible to see the moment of reckoning around people's, identifying and calling for justice around what's happening in Black communities. But how can we truly achieve justice for Black people without justice for Indigenous people? And if we were to really look at the groups that are most marginalized in our society, which are, our First Peoples, that would lift the floor for all of us. That would completely transform the conversation around race, identity, even a conversation around reparations and justice for all of us. And so, I really appreciated Terry's comments, and I would really challenge us all to think about folks who do bring that negative, divisive conversation to the table and challenge it, and recognize that this is not the oppression Olympics. We're all facing challenges, and we just really have to identify where we can work together and how we can be allies across these movements.
Thank you so much, Melana and Terry, for that. Does anyone else have any notes that they would like to add to this, or should we move on to, we have a lot of conversations planned today. Okay, if there are no one's immediately trying to jump in, I'm going to ask the next.
Actually, I would say just one quick thing, if that's okay. To really endorse and echo everything that's been said, and just to add another division that, just to explicitly put it out there, is the division between the sort of traditional climate movement and these other movements for justice. And in the last few years, there's been, much more understanding within the climate movement of how it can't succeed without lifting these other struggles, but there's still huge divides to overcome there that I would name, and that we aren't going to be able to preserve a livable climate without tackling white supremacy and racism and Indigenous sovereignty. So they're all connected.
Yeah, thank you. To bring it back to Melana, because I'm interested in starting to talk about food systems and their connection to all of this. Melana, do you want to just talk a little bit about how this pandemic has highlighted the vulnerabilities specifically in our food system in terms of production of food or accessibility of food? Yeah. Melana, did you?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Speak to that. So thanks for that question, and for really kind of highlighting the connection between food systems and a broader kind of climate conversation. I think it's identified it in a number of different ways, but maybe I'll focus on a couple for this conversation. So I think really one of the big pieces that I think people even who aren't working in food systems, but more broadly, is this conversation around essential workers. And I think this really does tie into what we were just talking about, because this conversation around essential workers are often the workers who are the most critical and the lifeblood of the food system, but are often invisible. and are not recognized in the same way that we talk about essential workers in the historical sense of firefighters and police officers and maybe even paramedics. But these are the people who are at our grocery stores day in, day out, processing food every single day, who are not able to stay at home. These are people who are working in the fields, whether farmers or particularly migrant workers. And these are people who, you know, without them in this moment, we would not have food on our tables, food in our grocery stores, ability to be able to sustain ourselves. And this is particularly identified as a vulnerability because these are also the same people who are some of the lowest wage workers in our not only food system, but actually in our labor market. They're more likely to have little to no protections whatsoever in terms of job security and also in terms of protections to be able to do their work. So recently we've seen migrant laborers, migrant workers, foreign temporary workers highlighted in the news as their rates of COVID-19 skyrocketing because of the very poor protections they've been provided. And even prior to this, the conditions that they were living in and the structures under which they have to operate are egregious and do not even meet health standards and labor standards here in Canada. So I think we're seeing a real crack and fissure in that system and how it operates, and a real need to reevaluate our food system and a call for justice and decent work, particularly for those laborers. And I would also echo that almost the majority of people who are in these roles are also racialized. They're people of color. Migrant farm workers are typically from Mexico and from the Caribbean, and there are also temporary foreign workers who are predominantly from Asia, the Philippines and other countries from that region. So that is a huge kind of vulnerability that's been highlighted. I think in addition to that, supply chains have really been cracked open as a real challenge for us. Canada is predominantly dependent on imports to be able to feed ourselves through a larger industrial agricultural system, and having to close our borders and not have the same flow through chains of food, we really have seen a need to be able to have stronger local food systems. And we do not have robust enough local systems to be able to provide food for people who need it. And this is extremely problematic when we're thinking about how we can sustain ourselves and how we can respond to a climate future that is sustainable, but that is also equitable, that has the resiliency and the resources within our system built up to be able to respond to those needs. In addition to that, I would also add that some of the other things that we've identified are weaknesses around a critical need and a gap to actually have institutions being set up to respond and access food. So for example, there's a large number of school food programs here in I'll speak about Toronto, but also across the country. And these programs are built on an infrastructure connected to schools and students. I mentioned earlier about food insecurity affecting a large portion of students in Canada, and those are typically racialized students, but not having a proper channel set up to be able to provide food to them is really hurt families, and seeing huge rates of food insecurity that are impacting those who are already the most vulnerable. The last thing I'll maybe talk about is, or maybe I'll pause and see if there's any comment, but I was also hoping to talk a little bit about what we can do to address some of these challenges that I'm raising.
I would love to get into that. I think maybe that would be saved for, we have a good question from the audience that I want to pitch first. And we can throw this one to Troy. So this person says, Troy was speaking to animal agriculture as a huge emitter and contributor to the climate crisis. I'm sorry, because the question got moved. Speaking to animal agriculture as a huge emitter and contributor to the climate crisis, and this is also tied to transmission interfaces during epidemics. And how can we change the agriculture and food infrastructures in Canada in such a way to reduce emissions and transmissions, but equitably keeping in mind the inequalities in food security and policy? Yeah, maybe Troy or Melana, do you want to take this up?
It's a big question. I'm wondering if you might actually post it in the chat to see it. But I think what they're really trying to get at is the idea of how do we create a food system that takes into account how to lower emissions while also you know, staying true to principles around justice and equity and decent work. I'm just going to make sure I got all the components of that. How can agriculture and food? Yeah, so I think there's a couple of pieces here. Something that's also been highlighted, but I think was evident before, the crisis is a real shift in what we need as kind of like the structural pieces within the food system. So I mentioned about supply chain, but there's also simple things like having processing. So here in Ontario, we're the largest province in the country, and we don't have mid-scale processing to allow food to come to a place and be distributed locally, still regionally, but being able to be processed, whether that's grains or other things, to be able to go and be sold. Whereas instead, we have to send it quite far, whether that's to the States or to other places, to have it be processed or being go through distribution plants. And so as a result of that, we're pushing food far from its origin and creating additional emissions that are unnecessary in that process. And so part of the solution is thinking about what do we need to set up to create smaller supply chains. And so a piece around that is also creating the capacity of local farmers, of local distributors, of local millers, processors to be able to do that work. And we don't have programs in place, whether that's funding from the government. We don't have training in place to be able to train a new generation of farmers, with farmers aging out. Majority of farmers here in Canada are over the age of 50, and creating an impetus and an interest in a new generation to understand you know, how to farm more ecologically, how to use traditional systems of knowledge and ways of knowing that have worked and are good for the environment to be able to produce food, and have been shown to produce food in a way that is still with a high yield and with a higher quality often than large-scale agriculture that feeds into biodiverse ecosystems. I also think that a key part of this is also thinking about creating better access to land. So you often find populations who are interested in food and engaging with food don't have quality land to grow on. So we talked about environmental racism and the quality of land on reserve and in Indigenous communities. Well, you know, they have hunting and fishing rights, but are not able to do so and to be able to sustain themselves. So I think there's almost like a moment of coming back to this conversation around really identifying key principles to underpin our food system. Food sovereignty or Indigenous food sovereignty is often kind of a concept that I like to talk about, to think about those key principles that would underpin a food system that addresses many of the things you're asking in this question. I could talk about a bunch of policy areas that would help address that, but I won't go into that, and more say that starting from a principle that allows for equity and justice in food work, that allows people to have sovereignty over the food they access so that it's culturally appropriate and that it's produced in a fair way, are the principles that ground being able to move forward in a food system with that meet some of the key points that you're raising in your question.
Troy, I know we'd love to also hear your thoughts on this question, but you also wrote about dehumanization of nature and that capitalism is kind of all about reorganizing nature. Can you tell us more about how colonial invasion has shaped inequality in food systems, mass extinction of global biodiversity, and the emergence of new diseases like Ebola and HIV?
I'd be happy to. I just wanted to touch on a couple of points that have been raised so far. I think you're bringing up a really good point. Sorry, Melana,
yeah.
Melania, about how capitalism changes people's diets and cuts off people from their traditional diets. And I think people think they automatically, you know, people want more meat, therefore it means getting more meat. But really, it's cutting people off from subsistence farming, be able to grow food that they have normally, and they are forced to buy food on the market, and then they're eating a lot more processed carbohydrates and processed meat. And you see this kind of wherever you see capitalism take root. So I think we have to kind of think about what does like a good diet or like a post-capitalist diet look like, and not think about not having meat as simply loss, right, or a sacrifice, but to think about how these diets changed in the first place. The other thing I would want to say is, if you talk about food systems, I think it would be remiss if we don't talk about how the part that broke down the most was the meat processing plants. I mean, they completely shut down, and they're the highest rates of COVID in the country, like 1,000 cases like at one slaughterhouse. And the question is why? And to go there, we have to think about history of capitalism and history of meat. Like the assembly line that we think of for car factories and Ford, Henry Ford got that idea from looking at meat processing in Chicago, where they would have a disassembly line. They would take an animal and try to efficiently cut it up and make it a package for consumers. And this has been fine-tuned for like 150 years, or almost 200 years, where people are packed close together. You have a very specialized cutting and slicing jobs, and because people are so close together, it's very easy to get COVID. But to actually break up that system and give people space, and the whole thing just falls apart because it's been so fine-tuned for so long, right? So this breaks down very, very quickly. This is not a resilient, meat or a food system at all. This is the weakest weakest link in the chain. I mean, first of all, it produces illness, but also it cannot withstand a shock. And then I also want to mention that, and people might think I brought up food and livestock and industrial agriculture as the cause of climate change and disease. And people might say, well, this didn't come from a factory farm like other outbreaks. It came from like a wet market, as people say. And I think you have to connect the two, saying why are people shifting into wildlife farms and poaching on a mass scale in China and other countries? It's because they've been displaced by these large factory farms, especially since the 1990s. They can't compete with these industrial farms, and therefore they're taking up other forms of employment that's actually encouraged by government. So I just wanted to clarify that these things are linked, because people think, oh, if we only got rid of that, then we'd be fine. Like, no, you have to change the food system entirely to actually get rid of disease or to address climate change. And the last thing I would say is that all these things are, again, connected, and I think I really want to focus on the animal aspect and conservation aspect of this. But animal rights groups and conservationists have been extremely racist, and they've been in very bourgeois white spaces, and that's why they've been extremely unsuccessful in pushing their agenda. They're very weak movements. And it's their own fault, basically, because they've not connected with a broader left or a broader social justice movement, environmental justice movement. I'm doing research right now on the Wild Foundation, which pushes for nature needs half, this goal of having half of the earth being rewilded, which is something I agree with. But all these people, they're associated with Rhodesian mercenaries and the ultra racists, basically. So it's very unfortunate. I think these are important things to talk about when we are trying to understand why and how to actually fix these movements. We have to address these questions. So I'll try to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say the humanization of nature. So I think when most people want to have like a big frame to understand the environmental crisis, they say the Anthropocene. And I don't think this is actually a very useful term. It doesn't really tell you what it is, and people think, okay, it's humans are affecting natural systems. That's very obvious, right? It doesn't tell us why we're affecting systems. And generally, the debate has been about when exactly do you kind of put the golden spike? When exactly do you say, well, here's when the Anthropocene started? Is it the invention, right, the onset of agriculture 10,000 years ago in some places, or is it nuclear weapons, or is it the steam engine? All these things, and that's the general debate. Another thing I would point out is the people who are really behind the Anthropocene concept, they have close links to geoengineering. Like Kreutzen, he was who wrote a big paper on the Anthropocene in 2000. He wrote another paper in 2006 saying the geoengineering is a tool that we should take seriously. And I think this is a very dangerous idea to actually try to directly change the atmosphere so we can cool the earth and keep on burning fossil fuels. So this is a dangerous idea in many ways. But again, it's not a useful idea. The useful idea, I think, is something called the humanization of nature, which comes from Marx and Hegel, and they talk about humans. What humans do is that they live in a world that is alien to them. And you don't have to agree with every part to this. I definitely don't agree with every part of this. But they live in a world that's alien to them. They don't understand nature. They don't know nature. So how do they know nature? They understand it better when they actually work, when they labor in nature. So when they redirect nature's flows towards their conscious ends, so this is a gardening or industry and agriculture, that is redirecting natural flows. And what's unusual about our society is that what's directing this labor and directing this intercourse with nature is capital. So capital is this autonomous force that's not a thing; it's a social relationship that we have. But but the need for it to reproduce itself with a profit as it goes through a commodity circuit, that need then determines how we actually interact with nature, right? We always are trying to make a certain profit and redirecting resources that way. And no one's actually in charge of that. This is an unconscious way to run society. This is when the market is running society. So instead of the humanization of nature, we have something, we can call it the capitalization of nature. So this is why we can be aware that we're heading towards a huge catastrophe, but then we can't seem to do anything about it because society is not run by, no one's in control of society. Society is decentralized and run by capital. So I think this term lets us to put different parts of the puzzle together. I mean, we can start with pre-capital societies and go back to the onset of agriculture, but then understand that our current era is unusual because it is capitalist, right? This is, and then it makes my first point about what is the environmental crisis. The environmental crisis is redirection of nature towards human ends or capital's ends, and not having enough space for the biosphere to actually function. And in terms of epidemics, we can see, well, okay, as soon as we have this relationship with nature, you're going to get disease, right? So epidemiologists, they break up history into 3 epochs, which coincides with my narrative generally. The idea is we have of animals in agriculture, especially in the old world, and people are getting disease. I mean, you have influenza, you have leprosy that comes from wildebeests. Influenza comes from chickens. You get a variety of diseases from camels and gerbils, and any kind of domesticated animal is going to give you disease. Over these thousands of years, these diseases emerge, and then we have periodic epidemics. The problem is, I think, when people, they think that the COVID is equivalent to these previous outbreaks. Like, oh, we have always had disease. There's nothing unusual about this. Like, it's just like a random event. It's going to hit us eventually. But the way epidemiologists talk about this is you have this earlier period, and then from the 19th and 20th centuries, you have a second period where we seem to be able to catch up at some level with controlling disease. We have vaccines. We have antivirals, we have antibiotics, we have public health measures, as in we realize that having, unsafe slaughtering practices, or having dirty streets and having pigs live in your house, all these things can lead to disease. So we start cleaning up cities. And then between 1800 to around 1970, it seems like we're actually catching up at some level. And people in the 70s, they say, eventually there's going to be no more disease, right? And no more infectious disease. And then you have a sudden increase in the number of diseases. You suddenly get Ebola emerging, and it's identified in 76. HIV is identified in 1980. And you get more and more diseases that are coming out. And that's because that interface that I was talking about between humans and nature is increasing. And we have suddenly a lot more industrial agriculture, mining, forestry, especially in the global south, than you did before. And this is increasing, and you're also getting a gigantic increase in the number of diseases. So we shouldn't be surprised something like this hit. I mean, people were saying before, we're going to have a disease that's going to have a long incubation period, and that means we won't be able to detect it, and it's going to be hard to stop. And this is exactly what SARS-CoV-2 is, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. And it could have been worse. I mean, the mortality rate is like 1 or 2%, but at least we didn't get a strain of avian flu that kills 60% of people. So it could definitely be much worse the next time around. But I think when we think about these three periods, we can then map that onto economic history as well and understand why we're in such a fix. And I forgot the point about you're asking about the Columbian exchange, as in why did so many people die when Europeans went to the New World? I mean, you have around 60 to 100 million people living in the New World, and that population crashes by around 90% over the next couple of centuries. And that's because people in the New World, they actually didn't have domesticated animals. So they actually had relatively few disease. We think humans have disease naturally. You actually don't have that much disease if you don't have domesticated animals. But Europeans did. The disease flows mostly one way, and with the exception possibly of syphilis. And then it leads to really horrible results. So you have a unification of the world by disease by that point, which is not a pretty thing. But I've taken up a lot of time, so I'll stop it there. But thank you for the question.
Can I add something really quickly to that?
Yeah, and then well, you can add something and we'll go on break because we're a little bit over time, but it's all right.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
It's really quick. The only thing I would add to that is just really, I think it's important as much as I think Marx and Hegel add a lot to this conversation. We like you mentioned, Troy. This isn't new, though. I think we have to give credit, and the problem with why we continue to see this these injustices resurfacing, and we're seeing disease show up the way they are, and this disproportionately affecting Black and Indigenous communities, is because we continue to ignore like the wisdom and the learnings of these communities. And so this idea of like the relationship between nature and human, I think what you were speaking to is true, but I think that's true in the Western colonial sense. I don't think we can and I don't think you were going to broad brush all humans, but I think it's really important to make the distinction that Indigenous folks and Black folks especially have had this understanding of how we need to work with nature and how we interact with nature. And the issue is that the ruling structures and who we listen to continues to be white settlers and white and Western colonial folks. So that was the one distinction I make. And the other thing I would just say is that I think to agree and just echo what you're saying about the animal rights movement, I think a really large issue with that is and why it's so violent that it occupies like these bourgeoisie like spaces is also because we know that like Black and Indigenous communities and racialized communities for so long were seen as less than animals, right? And so when you're pushing for the livelihood of animals, which is super fair and we need that, and I think the animal rights movement is right, but the reason they're failing is because by uplifting that and neglecting to also uplift the livelihood of Black and Indigenous people, you are erasing that violent history, and you are continuing to perpetuate that animals are better than humans. And if we actually want to equalize ourselves and make it so this relationship isn't top down anymore, then we need to also at the same time be fighting for that livelihood and the health and lives of Black and Indigenous people. So I think that's a really big point to make about that failing, and I think it's because of that violence that they continue to fail. So that's the only thing I would add. Sorry, that was just a very quick addition.
Right.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that. A very much needed intervention.
Wish there was a clapping function. That was a great comment.
Yeah, so we're gonna take a 5-minute break right around now. We'll see everyone back at around 6:15, 6:16 probably.
Thank you.
All right, are we back? Is everybody back? We will, let's see, make sure everyone's back.
Yeah, I think we're all here.
Awesome. Just a reminder for everybody, if you have questions for the panelists, please ask them with the Q&A function. The chat is just more for resources and things like that. And we also aren't going to be using like the raise hand function. So just direct all of your questions to the Q&A. So to go on to like a different but related and important topic, we'd like to kind of throw a question first to Dr. Sawin, but this is really open for anyone. You mentioned before there's this sort of idea that as humans are all stuck indoors, the whales and the moose are returning and the water quality and the air quality is improving and emissions are declining. There's this idea of like humans as the virus. And I was wondering what your thoughts on like, one, like, is this true, all these stories about this? And what are your thoughts more generally on this narrative that pits human life and ecosystem function against each other as like mutually exclusive?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really important set of questions. I was really disturbed when I started noticing on social media people talking about, see, this is proof that humans are the virus, just like you said, Sydney. You know, for a couple of reasons, and it actually touches back to before the break what Yasmeen said about there's a danger of kind of thinking about a universal human nature in terms of what we see from colonialist settler Western systems, which many of us have been socialized in and grown up in. So the first thing is, to immediately go to that perspective, I think is a mistake. I think the second mistake is, instead of saying we're the virus, maybe to say COVID-19 is basically holding up a mirror to us. It's showing us what our systems are designed around. So of course, if we have a system that's based on fossil fuels and we stop using parts of that system, fossil fuel emissions will go down. But that's more a reflection of the systems that we've built, and systems we've built, we can unbuild, we can change. And we can achieve that in ways that obviously don't come with just this horrible suffering and loss of life and rising inequality that the pandemic brings. Like, that's the worst possible way to try to solve our environmental problems. And I would just highlight all the other ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that, instead of coming along with suffering and loss, come along with lots of opportunity and potential. And so some of the things to name: we could leave fossil fuels in the ground, so leave coal, oil, and gas in the ground. We still need to get around, right? Well, there's active transportation, there's walking and cycling. That's one of the highest priorities, especially for urban areas, which come along with all sorts of co-benefits in terms of people's health. Just getting more access and safe ways to get access to physical activity reduces diseases that come from lack of physical activity. We can move from dirty, polluting ways to generate electricity, like coal-fired power plants, to renewable energy like wind and solar. When we do that, air pollution clears up. So all the small particles from coal, oil, and gas, from automobiles and power plants, many of which are concentrated in communities of color and low wealth communities who don't have the political power to push back against those siting decisions. So suddenly you see all the diseases that come along with air pollution getting better. And so that's cardiovascular disease and respiratory illness and premature birth, to name just a few. And in fact, the World Health Organization has done a study that says that the health savings that come along with getting off of fossil fuels are worth the same amount of money as it will cost to get off of those fossil fuels. I find that many people don't know that statistic, but when you step back and take more of a whole systems perspective, you start to see that there are costs to make these transitions, but there are benefits. So I think that COVID-19, just to come back to your question, COVID-19 is not at all a good model for what this transition needs to be to protect the climate. We don't want to go about it in ways that are creating so much hardship for so many people. Where we want to turn our attention are all the ways to make this transition that bring other benefits along with them. And the final point I would say, just to touch back on something I said in the introduction, if we have to redesign all these systems, so we need better public transportation, walking, cycling, renewable energy, more efficient homes, we can do that redesign in a way that addresses the structural inequities that are in our system. But we can only do that if we're really keeping inequity at the front of our mind, that we're not treating this just as a technical problem about tons of CO2. And so that starts with who's involved in the decision making. How do we share power? How do we bring communities into active decision making and leadership decision making about this transformation? So I really like the language of a just transition that many people use, which I think sums up, so much of that.
Yeah, thank you. And our group will actually be hosting an event soon. It hasn't been published yet, but we'll be hosting an event about the just transition later. So if you like our page, you can maybe hear more about that if you're interested in this topic. I want to open up this question though about this humans as the virus to anyone else who might have commentary. I think maybe Yasmeen, do you have anything to say on this idea?
Yeah, sure. I think that that language or that narrative is definitely ecofascism, right? Because like it's again perpetuating that same narrative, like overpopulation is the reason behind this, or like when it comes to food scarcity or like how much food we have on, and I'm sure Melana could speak more to this because again, like that's more of your expertise, but we have more than enough food on this earth to feed the population and more. Like it's the issue of why these things are in place is because of the ruling structures and systems. And so to make these general broad statements like humans are the virus or it's because of overpopulation, you're continuing to perpetuate this narrative. And sorry, like ecofascism, like a good way to summarize it would just be, like humans are the issue to the planet, or why we're overpopulated. And like to change this, we have to reduce human population. And I think what the question there also is like, what human population do you want to reduce? Like who's gonna have these restrictions on like birth? And we know that if that were to be taken up, that it would be racialized people and probably Black and Indigenous people. And we've seen that before through the history of Planned Parenthood, where it was made to like sterilize Black women, right? And we've seen that in China with the one child's rule, right? So we're just looking at the ways in which this will perpetuate, again, like this disproportionality against racialized communities. But that's all I would add. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you, yeah. It's a lot, it's a big question, but does anyone else want to take it up briefly before we move on?
Could I jump in? Or?
Sure.
I mean, I need to think about where these ideas come from, and this idea about population comes from Malthus, of course, and he wrote this to attack utopian socialism. There were this idea of the Enlightenment, just generally saying, "Oh, things will get better. We're becoming more rational, and things, we'll create this wonderful future." And he's saying, "No, like the problem of population will always keep people poor, and the only way, and we have to actually welcome these checks upon population, be it war, or starvation, or epidemics, and so forth." So that's where it comes from. What's actually interesting about Malthus is that he came up with this, which is really the basis for why we talk about overpopulation. But he actually was quite critical of the genocide against Indigenous people in the Americas. He thought this was a horrible thing. So I think it's a bit strange that he could think those things at the same time. And if you fast forward to the 20th century, you have the Tragedy of the Commons, which is probably the most cited paper all the time, something like 40,000 citations, by Garrett Hardin, who was a white nationalist. I mean, he wrote in white nationalist newspapers. He was unapologetic about that, and he would say, when there was the famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s, you should let those people die. He wrote about something called lifeboat ethics, saying, it is not ethical to let people on your lifeboat if you don't have enough space. You have to let them die. So he was extremely brutal. He's extremely influential still in the environmental movement. People still cite him as if that's completely okay. And the Tragedy of the Commons itself was a critique on the overuse of public goods, this idea of having too many people having their herds on a common, overgrazing it. And his solution was privatization or government control, but also it came down to getting rid of the welfare state, because the welfare state was allowing people to overbreed, as he would say. Right? So there's always this genocidal intent. And again, this idea is widespread in the environmentalist movement. Lots of people that we like David Attenborough, or James Lovelock, they are Malthusians, and they talk about humans as a virus, and it's disturbing. And again, this is the reason why no one likes environmentalists. This is why we're the bad guys in James Bond movies and things like that. So there's a good reason for it. And I just wanted to say quick that Yasmeen's comment on this criticism of the humanization of nature, how it expresses this alienation between humans and nature. It's very much a 19th century European perspective. I completely agree with you on that. It's a very weird perspective, but I think this idea still can be salvaged to help us understand why capitalism creates this mess.
Thank you, Troy. Yeah. any other thoughts on humans as the virus? Or actually, I think we should move on. We've got a lot slated and there's some stuff I want to talk about.
Can I add one more thing, but be very quick if that's okay?
Absolutely, sure.
So I just think it's interesting, just connecting the food system conversation to this, is that oftentimes agriculture more broadly is seen as this and agriculture and capitalist agriculture, large scale industry, is really seen as a driver to destroying the earth and our natural ecosystems and killing animals. And I would definitely agree, there's a lot of problems and it is a broken system in many ways. But I think a conversation that people are having is that we humans actually have the power to shift those systems. I really appreciated Dr. Sawin's comments around we've developed these structures and we can rethink them. And I think, I hope to speak more to this later, but that report I linked, the Eat Lancet report, really does talk about that shifting human diet to consume more plants, a plant-based diet has the power to significantly shift our environmental outcomes, to reducing climate change significantly and actually having really positive impacts on our human health. And so that's a behavioral shift that actually positions humans as the solution. And really simple steps that taken broadly can have a significant impact to improve the environment and revitalize systems. So I think it's really, instead about creating this divisive structure of polarizing humans and nature, it's actually about finding where the mutually beneficial actions and synergies exist to strengthen our understanding and connection, because believe it or not, we are nature. Science says so. And really about thinking about how our actions and our behaviors directly impact outcomes in the natural world.
Thank you for that. So we're going to go to another topic, which is more about science and communication, but also about the role of humans in understanding our place in nature. So one thing that has come out of this COVID crisis is that there have been a lot of very kind of hastily written scientific articles that are able to bypass the peer review process to be published, and then the findings of these articles are seized by the media and widely reported, despite not always being backed up by good science. So I was wondering, Terri, if you'd like to talk about this, and I'm really specifically interested in what you would say. Do you think that scientists who study these types of critical issues have a responsibility to make sure that the media doesn't misrepresent their findings? And what are some ways that we can hold scientists accountable, or scientists can hold each other accountable to understanding the broader impact of their research?
Very good question. It's actually something that's quite debated in the scientific community. I remember having a debate with a friend who is a neuroscientist. And I said, look, all of us, my partner, he's a computer scientist. And I said, you guys write crap papers that nobody outside of your fields can read. I mean, the jargon in it, the writing, do you have to take 38 sentences to say what could be said in 2? Right? And this is very, very common in a lot of this type of writing. And I don't know why it's so pervasive, other than people just like to sound complex sometimes. And I don't mean this of everybody, but it is very much out there. And the thing is that a common layperson can't really follow. You take a paper and you go, I don't understand this. And so I've said, look, as scientists, you guys have a responsibility to get this out there, get your work out there so people do understand it and can follow it. And he was absolutely adamant that, no, that's not my job. It's somebody else's job, because my job is to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And it is someone else's job to take my research and communicate it to the rest of the world. And there's validity to that too, based on the academic system of how that's set up. Because in the academic system, you're not rewarded for this. Yeah, you can put this on your CV that you're part of a panel, but when it comes to your tenure and promotion, you are not rewarded for doing a panel discussion that 100 people listen to and can understand and distill what you're saying in your research and your work. You're not rewarded for the community outreach and just general knowledge. When you appear as a scientist on TV, if you're an academic, you don't get rewarded for that in the academic system. And that's something I think academia needs to have a reckoning with, to say, look, we need to get the word out there, and how we do these things. And maybe Dr. Sawin can talk a little bit more about, you know, the system. But I think scientists absolutely have a job to get that work out there. And then also keep in mind about how that work is perceived. And all of us who have been following the climate change movement for decades now, you know, the truth of the matter is that we keep losing to the professional communications people. And part of that is we like to write with nuance, and I'm not blaming anyone for that, because certainly you can't just make a broad statement without backing it up, blah, blah, blah. And what ends up happening is you're like, oh, well, we have like a 2 degrees of uncertainty, so we don't know how many degrees the Earth is going to warm. And someone like Fox News will latch onto that and say, well, we don't really know if the Earth is going to warm at all, and so we can't take action because of jobs and economy and blah, 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 right? And so we're losing that communications battle. And how do we bring that back into focus and win that? Well, if you have a quick answer, I guarantee someone will give you a PhD for it. It's exactly what I'm trying to study. How do we fix this? How do we make it so that, you know, we don't lose the nuance of what science is? Because science is not just a bunch of facts. Science is a method. And those facts can change over time as we find new information, new methods, new microscopes, like whatever it is. Those facts can change. And science is the method. And yet, because there is uncertainty in that method of how we see something, you know that saying, how just by looking at something, we can change what that measurement is, right? Right, the Schrodinger. So we understand that there is nuance, that we're not perfect. And yet it's that lack of perfection that I would blame it on the right wing. Like it is being latched on and exploited. And that communication part is. And so on one hand, I say, yes, scientists absolutely have a responsibility to get their work out there. And this whole notion of staying in your lane is kind of silly. Well, what lane is that? Right? We all share this planet. We all live here. You know, if humanity is going extinct, we're all going with it. So what lane are we supposed to that doesn't infringe upon someone else's idea of where we're supposed to be staying? So 100%, we do have a responsibility. How do we do that while working in the language of the nuance that we like to use, and being true to the science and without being exploited? That is much harder.
Yeah, thanks for that. And another thing, of course, to consider in this is that when science is translated into media, there's like another step of just choosing which data to collect and report can influence what people are able to know. And so I was wondering, maybe Dr. Sawin, do you have any response to what Terri said, and then also just about choosing to report certain data?
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. I agree with everything that Terri said, and would just emphasize, I think, a few more things. One is there's this still very dangerous myth of both science and journalism as being objective, as though we show up without our perspectives. So number one, if I could change anything, would be for scientists to really work harder to understand their own blind spots and to name them as like upfront. I'm a middle-aged white woman from the Northeast of the United States, you know, and that affects my science. So that's the first thing I would say. Of course, that leads you immediately to restructuring science and journalism to be more inclusive so that you have different perspectives from the beginning. And then at Climate Interactive, a big part of our mission we think of as democratizing access to scientific information. So we don't actually do too much original research, but what we really focus on in our climate modeling is taking the findings of academic peer-reviewed articles, these same things Terry's talking about, and packaging them into very fast interactive simulations where we say we're the advocates for the question. So we're not going to make grand pronouncements about what people ought to do, but we think that all people ought to have access to the ability to ask what-if questions. What if we had a carbon price? What if we reduced the consumption of meat? What if we preserved half of the space of the planet for rewilding. Our tools allow people to ask those types of questions. And we want them to do that in a conversation with each other and in a conversation with their elected officials. The last thing I would say about that, and this will be a lifelong process for us at Climate Interactive, but is to layer in on top of the science those questions about equity and justice and fairness. So in our tools, we try to make it so if someone wants to test a carbon tax, they're going to also encounter some questions about what might a carbon tax do for people who live on a fixed income and have, the biggest energy burden. That is, the biggest share of their income goes to their energy costs. Because a question about the global climate isn't separate from those questions about the impacts on our communities. So it is a lot more effort to layer those pieces in, but the other approaches don't seem to be working. I think we've been pounding on climate change for a really long time. So going at it in different ways, it just seems like it's entirely needed.
Could I jump in just just a small comment?
Go ahead.
The only thing I would also add, I think in academia that we really need to address is classism, and the reason why science continues to not be able to be addressed publicly or be heard publicly is because it's built in a classist and racist system. And I think there's an ability for science to be woven into traditional knowledges. And I'm thinking of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, right? So I think the problem with why science is not getting addressed by the greater population and why we can't hear or we can't get people to be on our side is because it's still rooted in whiteness. It's still rooted in classism, right? And I think to be able to have a better communication style means that you need to start abolishing those systemic structures that are showing up in academia. And to do that, you need to stop giving white scientists the best platforms. And I think the last thing I would say there is, even when it comes to publishing, publishing is a racist and classist institution as well. So it's how do people get their work out there? And I think what we need to do is shift towards public education, right? And I'm thinking of Rachel Cargill. There's people who are doing the work for free because it's better for society, but we're ignoring them because they don't have the same esteem or credentials. And so there's a way to have science in a public forum, but it's just really about having to break down these institutions. And so there needs to be a let go of these institutions. So that's the only thing I would add. But yeah, also addressing that I'm also in this institution. So it's really, you have to figure out how to grapple with it.
Thank you for that, Yasmeen. Thank you for the shout out for Braiding Sweetgrass, one of the best books I've read this summer. This might be our last question before we move into the audience Q&A, and I want to hear everyone's thoughts on this, but maybe we'll start with Melana. So Melana, once we reopen our daily lives, will there be any going back to normal or how it was before the pandemic? And do you see this period, the pandemic, the unemployment, the protests, the beginnings of a new abolitionist movement as a turning point for humanity?
That is a big question. A good kind of final thought from some of the panelists. To be honest, I hope we don't go back to normal. I think we've had a really, interesting conversation about some of the fissures within our systems, some of the folks that are prioritized in the systems and in the structures that exist, how white supremacy still is deeply steeped in the environmental space, and there is a need to shift the conversation and center different voices. And I think that there is a broader awakening happening, a class kind of, consciousness around not only how identity and discrimination and racism and white supremacy has operated to subjugate certain bodies and opinions and voices, but that if we don't address this, our societies can't thrive. And that this is not only a question of morality and a question of the right thing to do and a better culture for everyone, but we, there is no future. It's actually a risk beyond just our social environment, but for our environmental, climate future, collective future. And so I think it's imperative that there's a shift. in terms of, for me, elements that I think are critical for that shift, I really think that there's a really exciting moment for young people to kind of take the reins and step into leadership, to ask questions, to challenge things, to imagine new ways of doing things. I think it cannot be young people alone, but I think that there's a real moment to rebuild structures. We heard a lot of discussion around grassroots groups, looking back at traditional knowledge and learning and educating and steeping ourselves in those traditions, not because youth bring this newness, but because there's an opportunity in youth and a bit of a privilege in the opportunity to unlearn, and the time and the moment to really invest in those moments and build connections that are intergenerational, recognizing that we are someone's future ancestors. We are going to be the longest keepers of this land. So as a young person myself, I really see an opportunity there. But I think some of the things I would maybe just pause and reflect on are kind of some of the ways that could happen. And I really just urge everyone who's listening to the panel to just take a moment to start with yourself. I think there's so much ambition and desire to shift and transform the world around us, but we have to remember we are all actors in this world, and we are all complicit in these conversations, whether we're referencing our identities in academia or our experiences around what we're eating and how we're contributing to or playing into narratives around the industrialized food system and our relationship with nature. Whether it's something as simple as just trying to get through the day in spaces that are quite, racially tense, as either settlers, as white people, as racialized bodies, and how we are complicit in this system, and what unlearning and privilege do we hold to be able to challenge the ways we are all doing things. I also think that there's a real moment for all of us also to look at the different structures and organizations we're a part of and how we can start to shift that. Whether you want to join a board or whether you want to have an incredible group like this and host those conversations to raise people's expectations of the world around them. I think this moment is really about the power that we all have and the role that we all have to really realize some of the change we want to see. And I think it just has to start with us. So I think that's my take on this moment and my kind of optimism and hope for where we're going. But I can only hope it won't be the same.
I guess, Yasmeen, do you have any other concluding thoughts before we move to the Q&A?
Yeah, not much other than I'm also hoping it won't be the same. I think especially when we talk about like police and these structures, I'm hoping we're seeing the abolition of the police, and I think we just need to have like a stance of radical hope and move with love ethic, but really hold each other accountable in these moments. I think we're seeing really big wins, and in order for this movement to be sustainable, we need to get ego out of this and make sure we're reflecting and not getting co-opted by prestige. I think that's a really big thing, and I'm hoping that we're shifting out of this need to have like these formal credentials to justify how change works. So real change happens in the streets, and we're seeing that, so we need to continue to do that. That's all I would add.
Any of the other panelists, would you like to add something?
Briefly.
Yes.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
So just combining the last two questions, I guess. I think one way to think about the future, but also to think about what's going on with science right now, is to look back to neoliberal debates over science. And again, as I said, I'm a historian of neoliberal thought. And what's interesting about them is they began in a confrontation with science in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. They really thought that most scientists and engineers were socialists, and they didn't like that. But also science itself was seen as a site of knowledge production that they didn't like. Because what neoliberalism is, in a nutshell, is that the market is not simply a place where you move things around, but rather it's like a vast machine that collects knowledge in the form of prices. And it is much better at doing that than any other social institution. So therefore, you want to set everything on market lines, including knowledge production. So therefore, it's not about experts deciding amongst themselves what the science is. They want to have a marketplace of ideas. They want the market to decide what ideas are most effective, which is why they have been attacking science and the universities generally for quite a while now. So I think what we're seeing is that the neoliberals are very effective at getting what they want, because first of all, they have a belief that they believe very strongly, but they also have a very effective network of think tanks and universities and political action groups to get things done. But for example, in this crisis, they've been able to destroy, I think, peer-reviewed science, which has been a long-term goal of theirs. But they've also been able to achieve things such as homeschooling, because they also hate public education, and they also they don't like Medicare, and they want people to just call a doctor. They don't want people to actually see a doctor, because that's only for rich people. So they've been able to achieve a lot of goals that, because and take advantage of the crisis in a way that I don't think the left is going to be able to, simply because we don't really have a worldview that's as comprehensive and effective as the neoliberal worldview. We just have a collection of goals. But I'll stop there.
Terri, I would love to hear your brief thoughts about this.
I agree with what everyone else said. My only thing I want to add is I also don't want to see us go back to the before times. I've taught my daughter to ride a bike on not exactly car free, but very low volume streets, and the pollution that my kids have had to breathe in the last 3 months has drastically gone down, at least in my area. But the number one takeaway of this crisis is I hope people see that we can actually live with a lot less energy. And we've been fed into we have to do certain things and we have to live a certain way. And let me just take one industry that's been death, for example, it's fast fashion. How many people of us miss fast fashion? Yet it is 8 to 10% of global emissions. And what does it add to our value of life? Does it add to our mental health? Does it add to how we see ourselves? Well, maybe how other people see us, right? It is, to me, a pointless industry. And yet one that we've allowed to generate almost 10% of our emissions. And so when we're talking about, all these other themes about are we the virus, it's not really us that's the virus, it's our consumption levels. Even if you eliminated everybody living in a developing world, you're only gonna reduce emissions by single digits. If we want to really start talking about population control, start with the billion. If you have over $1 billion of wealth, then you can't have any kids or something, right? That's what we got to have a conversation about. It's not about controlling the population, because that's not going to do anything for us. So, I look at the crisis right now, what we're doing, what we're going through, and we've stopped basically the entire industry stopped in its tracks, 10% of emissions, and we didn't even miss it. And so think about what else we could live without that we're barely going to miss. And I think that's going to be the biggest takeaway of, at least on the personal level, many of us are living with much lower carbon footprint because, and I think that's something that we should all look at. And then, on the industrial side, of course, there's lots of structural issues that we have to deal with. And that's not for us on the individual level to figure out. But if they're not feeding a lot of that consumption, then that obviously is going to go down in a bit of a corresponding way.
And it's only fair if we hear from Beth. Just one more brief thought.
Yeah, I will be very brief. I mean, the old normal was intolerable for almost everyone, right? Even people who thought they were comfortable were living with the soul deadening impacts of privilege and violence. So it really wasn't good for any of us. We also aren't going to be able to snap back to it because we're collectively so far in overshoot of Earth limits that it's not like these are the last shocks. We're going to keep getting shocks. They're basically built in at this point. So it's a question of how we're going to, I think, navigate these waves of shock. And I'm putting a lot of hope and certainly my energy into, so far it's still a small undercurrent, I'd say, but we see this at city, state, and national levels, and we're tracking this at Climate Interactive. We're building a little database you can find on our website about it, where people are figuring out how to simultaneously reduce emissions, prepare for future shocks, and address structural inequities. And that there's lots of examples, but they can be very simple things, like an electric utility has an e-bike program that's aimed at marginalized communities to help people get to work. So there you're reducing emissions, you're building equity, you're doing it in a community-oriented way. And you can scale that all the way up to nations that have solar and wind programs that have an equity layer built into them. So it's totally feasible, but we have to come together in different ways and break down the silos we've been talking about these whole 2 hours. So that's, to me, one place that really is a worthy place to put our support. And wherever you're situated, you can find those efforts.
Thanks. We'll go into the Q&A. We have a lot of questions which we won't be able to address, unfortunately. One sort of general theme that's been asked in multiple questions is for Yasmeen. Multiple people have been asking about your work with gentrification and like urban landscapes. I was wondering, just, there's a lot of different questions in here, but what are your takeaways about how COVID-19 has affected like urban lives and urban agriculture and like new businesses and gentrification? Like, where do you see all of this fitting in?
Yeah, I think that's a broad question, but I think what we really need to focus on with regards to the way in which COVID's affecting like the urban is that we are seeing, again, I think it's really important actually to firstly name that urban planning is also like a very racist field. And the way in which our cities are designed and continue to be designed is to segregate folks. So when we're talking even about food sovereignty, it's also like food apartheid. Like that's what's happening. It's not, again, about the lack of food. We're looking at like who gets access and why they get access. And so when it comes to gentrification, with COVID specifically, we're seeing, again, these like lower income communities get hit hardest, and these small businesses get hit hardest. And so I think a large part of that that we need to be aware of is the way in which police play in biosurveillance, and how that has been that's been a request, I guess, by the public, is to have this biological answer to like solving this. But with that comes surveillance. And so these communities are already extremely surveilled, and police in these lower income communities that are often being gentrified, specifically in the Toronto context, Toronto Community Housing Corporation, it's in their mandate and in their strategic plan to work with the police. And that is a large reason why communities like Regent Park or Jane and Finch or Eglinton West don't have access to the same social and structural determinants of health. And a really good example, and then I'll stop because I'm sure there are other questions, is thus that people downtown, for example, in wider areas, in wealthier areas, were able to kind of move publicly. But with COVID, we saw in Jane and Finch, which again is a highly racialized community, an immigrant community, the police were constantly stopping Black and racialized people from going to work, to getting on public transit, to going to the grocery store. They were asked if they're doing essential work. So we're seeing the way in which COVID has allowed for more surveillance and allowed for more policing of these communities. So yeah, keep it short. Sorry, that's kind of all over the place. Very glimpse.
It's all good. I think this will have to be our last question. I know there's a lot of really good questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them, but I hope everyone took away something from the discussion. And the last question is, in what ways do you see our formal education systems needing to change to support young people in effectively responding to these profound challenges and changes? I guess it doesn't matter who I start with. I guess I'll start with Melana, since you're closest to me on my screen.
Sure. It's a good question. It's funny you raise it. I'm doing work that's specifically looking to answer that broader question of how to prepare young people for, the economic future that's ahead of us in a post-COVID-19 moment. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of challenges because a lot of young people aren't able to access the classroom, aren't graduating in the same ways. Young people who experience various challenges and barriers, from mental health issues to barriers around access to technology, from having, you know, high-speed internet at home, to various other challenges, are really hit in this moment of needing to be completely digitally connected in all of the ways. And I think in this culture we're living in, there's a real assumption with the idea that everyone is connected and has access to all of those tools to be able to be connected. But in fact, that's not the case. And so I think the realities of the digital divide with the haves and the have-nots in regards to having, whether the skill sets, the technology, access to the infrastructure in the neighborhoods, and particularly in young people in Indigenous communities having challenges, you know, it's really heightened in this moment as well. However, there are a lot of opportunities. There's been a lot of research that has shown that in thinking about new ways of structuring learning and new ways of building relationships, there's an expanded scope of the types of times people can learn, increased flexibility, and real opportunities for groups who are typically disenfranchised by the systems we set up. So for example, people with disabilities, and the education system, and being able to access classrooms and spaces where they might not have previously, because there's been a lot of research that shows flexibility of hours and flexibility of the actual location really does benefit. I think the types of skills or learning that might really benefit young people to think about is really coming and thinking about things as being more connected, thinking about environmental issues as racial justice issues, learning about the economy as not someone who's obsessed with capitalism, but actually as an opportunity to think about what are our obligations to each other. What are the ways we want to show up in the world and contribute to the world? What if we thought about the economy as a structure of like what we were bringing into the world and what skills and knowledges we each contributed from our different positions in life, our gender, our race, our class, our experiences around you know, traditions and you know, our food heritage even, as ways for us each to shape the structures and the environment we have. So I think the opportunity for young people is coming into a world that's questioning all these things and having an opportunity to re-see things and show up for issues in a way that allows them to be joined up and intersectional. I know we're at the close of time, so I'm gonna let some other panelists speak, but it's been a real pleasure being in conversation with all of you tonight. And yeah, I think the education system is also a system with a lot of, it's a central site of systemic oppression and discrimination. And so for all of those things to be achieved, I think the first step is also going to be rethinking the structures for the systems around education as well.
Unfortunately, we're at time. Sorry, we couldn't hear from everyone else. But once again, thank you everyone so much for attending our COVID and climate webinar. I want to give a really big thank you to Terri Chu, Melana Roberts, Yasmeen Hassan, Dr. Beth Sawin, and Dr. Troy Vettese. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but thank you guys so much for coming. I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. And in case you missed something or want to rewatch the webinar, it was recorded and a video with closed captions will be up on our YouTube channel soon. We'll also compile all the resources and articles mentioned into a document that will be shared across our social media. And to make sure you see the video and resource documents once they're up, please follow Leap U of T on YouTube and Instagram, and Leap Chapter U of T on Facebook. And one last note, if you're a U of T student interested in doing direct climate action work or interdisciplinary educational events like this, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I am graduating, so I will be leaving LEAP, so please someone take my place. And we'll be hosting more events like this throughout the summer, so anyone's welcome to join, and hopefully we'll have our general planning meeting soon. Also, if you're a UC student specifically, you can join UC Lit Sustainability by contacting their Facebook, UC Lit Sustainability on Facebook, or sending them an email at sustainability@uclit.ca. And once again, thank you all for coming. Hope you all have a fantastic night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.